something happened in Washington last week that barely made the front page, and honestly, that itself tells you something. President Trump signed a national emergency declaration, not over oil, not over semiconductors, not over a war, over fertilizer. I know how that sounds. But stay with me, because buried inside that decision is a warning about something much bigger. How fragile America's food system actually is, how exposed global supply chains have become, and why grocery prices may not be done rising. So let's get into it. What happened? Why fertilizer? And why right now? On June 29th, Trump signed a presidential proclamation declaring a national emergency over America's phosphate fertilizer supply. The specific action, suspending anti-dumping and countervailing duties on phosphate fertilizer imports from Morocco for up to 8 months, or until the emergency is lifted. The reason is straightforward. The administration needed to get fertilizer into the country before the next planting cycle, because if that window closes without enough supply, what follows is not just higher prices. It is reduced harvests, tighter food stocks, and another round of food inflation that nobody wants to talk about heading into an election cycle. The White House made its position explicit. Fertilizer is no longer just a farm input. It is a national security matter. To understand why that framing matters, you need to understand what fertilizer actually does. I will keep this brief. Modern agriculture runs on 3 nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Phosphate fertilizer delivers the phosphorus that crops need to grow and produce yield. Pull it out of the equation and production falls hard. Corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, cotton, virtually everything moving through the American food system depends on reliable phosphate availability. And here is the timing problem that made this urgent. Farmers typically purchase more than half their annual phosphate fertilizer between fall and early spring. That means a supply disruption right now does not just create price noise. It threatens the actual harvest cycle. The damage lands months later at the grocery store. So what triggered the emergency? According to the administration, it was not one shock. It was several hitting at once. Global fertilizer supply chains have been under pressure from ongoing geopolitical conflicts, particularly around production regions and export routes. The U.S. and Israel's military operations against Iran effectively disrupted shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, which I have covered in previous videos, so I will not repeat that here. Meanwhile, Russia, one of the world's largest fertilizer producers, has faced its own export complications. And shipping disruptions across key maritime routes have made moving fertilizer slower, more expensive, and far less predictable. Put all of that together and you get exactly where Washington ended up. Prices rising, supply shrinking, planting season approaching, and a narrow window to act. That is where Morocco comes in. Morocco sits on some of the largest phosphate reserves anywhere on Earth. It is a major global exporter, and critically, one of the few stable suppliers still in a position to ship to the United States reliably. The policy response was practical: temporarily remove the tariffs on Moroccan phosphate imports to accelerate supply and bring costs down. It is not a permanent fix. The administration described it as a bridge measure, a pressure valve to buy time. Whether it holds depends entirely on how long the underlying disruptions continue. And that raises the harder question. If phosphate fertilizer is this important, why is the United States not simply producing more of it at home? The answer comes down to capacity and time. The U.S. does produce phosphate fertilizer domestically, but not at the volume needed to cover full demand once exports and industrial consumption are factored in. Scaling up is not a quick process. New mining operations, processing plants, and chemical facilities take years to permit, finance, and build. The investment incentives are not there, the infrastructure is not ready, and the regulatory pathway is slow. In the near term, imports are not a policy preference. they are a necessity. The immediate effect of the emergency declaration is expected to show up first with farmers. Lower import costs could reduce fertilizer prices by around 22%, which would ease one of the biggest recurring costs in crop production at a time when farming margins are already thin. But the effects do not stop there. Cheaper, more stable fertilizer supports higher yields in the coming growing season. Higher yields reduce the risk of supply shortfalls, and supply shortfalls are what eventually drive food prices higher, not immediately, but with a lag that shows up reliably in the data. There is also a geopolitical dimension here that I think deserves a moment. This declaration fits a pattern that has been building for several years now. Energy markets disrupted, semiconductor supply chains exposed, rare earth dependencies flagged as security risks, and now fertilizer. The common thread is that commodities once treated as purely commercial, things you just bought on the open market, are being reclassified as strategic assets. Governments are responding accordingly. Fertilizer supply breaking down does not just mean higher costs. It means lower yields, tighter food supply, and the political and social instability that follows. In that context, calling it a national security issue is not hyperbole. It is actually the correct framing. The emergency declaration runs for 8 months. It is designed to buy time, not solve the underlying problem. Ideally, domestic production expands during that window. But if global disruptions continue, and particularly if military operations in the Middle East escalate again, this will not be the last intervention of this kind. There is a broader takeaway here that I think matters regardless of your politics. We are in a period where supply chains cannot be assumed to be stable, where food security and geopolitics are not separate conversations, and where something that sounds as mundane as fertilizer can become the trigger for a national emergency, because without it, the food system that everyone takes for granted starts to crack. The next major economic shock may not start with oil prices or a banking crisis or a new military conflict. It may start somewhere quieter. And what happens in the months after that determines everything that follows. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe and share it with someone who should be paying attention. I cover this on Substack and Patreon as well, with more depth on the numbers and the geopolitical threads underneath. Links are in the description. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.